Normally, what a discussant would do is I guess kind of dig into these papers. But given that this is a relatively early stage and kind of in the spirit of what we'd like to do in the conference, I'm going to try to kind of take a little bit of a bigger picture view instead of kind of going into the details of the paper. So the title of this sort of session was "Who Gets Crowdfunded," which is kind of interesting. At least so I've done a lot of research on venture capital, which is sort of the angle that I'm coming from, and it would be very strange to show up at a conference and have the title of a session be "Who Gets Institutionally Funded." And part of the reason why is because sort of in the traditional literature, right, we really think quite distinctly about categories, right? So you might have who gets loans, you might have who gets venture capital, or even who gets sort of angel investments, but you wouldn't try to lump all of those together. And I actually think that's kind of an important issue here as well. So we actually have many different types of things, and this was alluded to some in the initial platform and even a little bit in the talks here. But we've got just to kind of lump, create some actually coarse-grained baskets. We have kind of donation or pre-sale sites, which we could think about Kickstarter, debt, which would be like prosper.com, and then equity. And certainly the Australian ASSOB would sort of fit in this kind of equity area. And I think one of the reasons that's important is because it means that you actually have both potentially different types of stakeholders that are involved with very different interests. So if we kind of think about what the types of stakeholders are, we're interpreting this a little bit as though these are all about investors, right? And there are investors involved here, and certainly these are methods for entrepreneurial finance, but that doesn't mean that the person who's putting the money in is kind of wearing an investor hat, right? So other types of hats that could be going on here. You could be a lender. A lender has a little bit different kind of values in terms of what they care about than an equity investor. You could be a consumer. I think a lot of what's going on in Kickstarter are people that really are interested in the products. They're doing almost like a type of shopping. Or you could have enthusiasts, right? So people that are investors, maybe are shoppers, but they also are really passionate about some area, and so they're getting their own types of utility or interests out of being involved in that as well. And so if we sort of think about what we have in these different sites, I think we have kind of different combinations of interests, and it's important to kind of think about that. When we're assessing, what types of things are driving choices. I'm not saying that any of these are wrong, right? I mean, the enthusiast who's on the site is still getting a lot of satisfaction from being involved in those things. It's still a way to get a company going, but it might mean that they're driven by different types of factors when they're, trying to decide what to put their money into. It's also interesting, I think, when we're comparing it. So I think this question of selection and who gets funded is actually a pretty important one. It's important for at least three reasons, I would say. So one is that to the extent that there's differences in terms of who's getting funded by these various platforms versus, say, an angel or venture capitalist, it's telling us something about the extent to which they're likely to either compete or be able to cooperate across different kind of stages of funding. It's probably telling us something about potential for contributing to economic growth. If they're really funding the same types of projects as other types of funders, then it's just shifting sort of who's getting the returns, not necessarily actually creating new companies and new jobs. And it's also potentially important in terms of access, right? And I think particularly the results in terms of funding women entrepreneurs sort of speak to that potential. So one thing that we'd like to know, and Ethan probably addressed this most directly, is thinking about to what extent are the types of decisions made here differently from the types that you would get out of maybe an angel or a venture capital investor. Now, an angel investor is interesting because I actually think that they oftentimes have some combination of motives as well. Part of it's financial returns, but part of it's just the interest in being involved in certain companies. Venture capitalists could actually be quite different because they're primarily agents for the investors in their funds, and so they're going to be much more directly oriented towards financial returns. Now, The bad news here is that despite what Ethan said, we actually don't know a whole lot about what it is that drives angel investments and what it is that drive venture capital investments. And one of the great things about all of these papers relative to those literatures is that here we actually know something about the risk set. We know what are the investments that are out there that they could potentially have put money into, or projects that they could have potentially put money into, and which ones in the succeed. The problem with the angel investing and venture capital investing literatures is almost never do the academics who are doing research in those areas know anything about the projects that didn't get funded. So all they see is who got funded, and then they have to make some oftentimes relatively heroic assumptions about what the VCs looked at but decided not to fund. So that's the kind of I just realized that didn't turn out very well font-wise. Sorry. Now, in terms of going kind of more directly to the papers, I'd like to kind of use that lens a little bit to speak to a couple of the results. So, Ethan's paper looks at some of this information on Kickstarter, and I've kind of split this into kind of types of characteristics that might matter to choices. So there's characteristics of the founder, the venture. You could think about things about the founder-funder match, oftentimes based on some sort of social connection or social network. There's the project traits, which we could think of as being separate from the founder, right? And then there's even traits of the pitch itself, right? So how are we going to try and attract people to the venture? And the papers vary to the extent that they actually have some information on these different things. One thing that we don't know is, here we have, if we're sort of thinking about this from an investor perspective, we have a fair amount of information now on what information people seem to be reacting to, but not a lot of information on, in some sense, what the predictive validity of that, right? So is this, they're getting funded, but is this a good measure of whether or not the business itself is succeeding, or if it's an equity or debt, whether or not you're getting repaid? So, in Ethan's case, I think he framed this as this kind of wisdom versus madness of crowds. And while I kind of like the kind of the catchiness of it, I worry a little bit about portraying sort of the maybe non-economically related variables as being a type of madness. And it's particularly because I'm thinking this is, so Kickstarter is again one that's really more about either pre-sales or some types of donations. So to the extent that people are actually gaining utility from being involved in the website and perhaps from buying products that they think are really cool, it may not be that buying a product, for example, that has geek cred is an irrational thing. It may be something that they actually are deriving a lot of utility from. Right? And so therefore is in some sense creating value, even if it's not what we would think of as what a kind of a profit-motivated investor would do. Kind of moving on to the kind of the second one. So the Gunter paper is quite interesting. Because this actually is, an equity funding market. So this is the one that if we were going to think about comparing to, say, angel investor or venture capitalist, we might think would be the kind of closest comparison here. And it's one of the things that I found quite interesting that is if I look at the types of things that matter here, it actually looks a lot like the types of things that you would expect to matter to a professional investor, right? So, does the founder or their board, more accurately, have some type of business experience or business certification? What's do they have a financial plan? Have they actually sort of thought about what they're going to do? The one actually that surprised me here, though, was the IPO or M&A exit, right? Because the thing that drives the interest in that in venture capital is largely the fact that you have these funds that have limited lifespans, right? And so there's a need to liquidate the investment at the end. Now, for individual investors who are investing their own money, they shouldn't necessarily have that same liquidity preference. And so I found it a little bit surprising that they seem to be exhibiting the same type of desire to be in funds that were going to have an IPO or trade sale versus some other way of cashing out. And that might be something that I'd be curious to kind of learn a little bit more about where that is coming from. Perhaps they're emulating the professional investors that they think, sort of are doing the right thing. Shifting over, because I don't have a lot of time, but shifting over to the Alicia's paper. So gender, I think, is a really important topic, and more broadly, we could think about, people that might be getting excluded from traditional means of getting financing for their ventures. Are they able to get access through crowdfunding? And again, I like a lot of things about this paper. They sort of trying to divide sort of the supply versus demand side of the gender effects, which is great. But it's also interesting here thinking about, so they find some evidence of, kind of same gender preferences, both among men and, I would say, based on the stats, among women in terms of investing in companies. What would be interesting to know is, would this shift if it were in a different context, right? So in Kickstarter, it may have something to do with very kind of detailed natures of the types of products that are getting made and what the appeal of those products are. And that could be different if it was a situation where you're just being motivated by, kind of financial success. Although it could even be worse, right? So you could imagine that what would happen is, a lot of kind of latent gender biases could actually kick in even harder in a situation in which you believe that you're investing purely on the basis of likely financial returns. And last but not least, I'll say just a little bit about the crowd and community. I think this is an interesting paper. One of the things that I particularly liked about this is the fact that they went in and they were actually looking at what these pitches looked like, and that's something that's not in any of the others. Or at least not, kind of as extensively in any of the others. And what I found interesting is just, even though they're not really emphasizing it, just how big of an effect a lot of these things like the video quality, the written quality, whether or not there were errors in it, what a big size effect those had on the odds of investment. And one of the reasons I think that's interesting is because, so clearly people that are active on this site are using that as information. It's not clear that this is a signal in the sense of, say, Michael Spence, where this is something where it's actually indicative of a higher quality entrepreneur. And so, another way you could think about this is, why isn't this just cheap talk, right? Where anyone can, kind of put in a little bit of extra effort, make a nice video, and dramatically improve their chances. And perhaps what's going on, although the last results that Peter was showing suggest that this may not be the case, is that as you become more sophisticated in your interaction with the site, you sort of learn to kind of ignore some of that superficial information and go more deeply into some of the kind of underlying characteristics of either the product or the business idea. But I think there's a lot of potential for research in that area, particularly because you would think, to the extent we might worry about fraud, that knowing something about what are accurate signals would actually give us a lot of information in what might be useful means of, kind of in some sense, fraud protection. But I think this is great. A lot of introductory information about kind of how people are choosing their investments. And the other thing is now we've got a lot of people that you have met that you can try to talk to find out more about their projects on our break. So with that, I will invite you all to partake of some refreshments.